So Fauci still hasn't gotten back to me, right, at this point. And so I wrote him again, and I write him, hello, just bring this email back to the top of your inbox. As new facts emerge, I'm left with many questions. I'm hoping to connect at your convenience. Thank you, Dr. Fauci. And I get an email back from him tonight, and it says, Jenner, thanks for this note. Your proposal sounds interesting. However, I am totally immersed in the rollout of my memoir.
Wow.
On call. So I got a copy of the manuscript and the audio file for the book, and Fauci reads the book.
Part 1, from Bensonhurst to Washington.
It's crazy.
Brooklyn boy.
Yeah.
Anthony Stephen Fauci was born at Brooklyn Hospital.
And so I've just been going through the book.
The ultimate game changer.
And I have it playing in my car.
It's like stepping into an alternative universe.
Had what they referred to as instinctively good clinical judgment.
You know, it's this curated experience of Dr. Fauci with his Brooklyn accent.
If you want me to like soft-shell crabs, I like soft-shell crabs.
This is just nuts. And so I went to the COVID chapter, and he is bouncing around so much, it's really hard to follow.
Part 5, COVID.
I mean, he starts some point late in January.
In the Situation Room on January 29th, 2020.
And the first scene's an interaction with Trump.
Anthony, he said, you are really a famous guy.
He barely mentions Bob Redfield at all.
Bob reported that Gao assured him the situation was under
definitely
control.
doesn't mention that they were arguing about the origin of the
I
virus.
had the sense that something large and frightening was
And
on
I
the
can't find
horizon.
any mention of the Fern cleavage site.
We had been considering the next step for a few days.
He doesn't say anything about these panicked emails and trying to get in touch with everybody for a secret teleconference. No mention whatsoever of how they didn't invite Bob Redfield.
The upshot, I became the de facto public face of the country's battle with the disease.
It's hard to look at this and not see a pattern. And the pattern is this completely curated version of history.
Calm the country's anxieties and provide factual information. People should not be walking around with masks.
A lot of this wasn't even factually true, and the way he's describing this to the public and in his book is exaggerated at best.
Bats as they evolve.
If not, it was legitimately misinformation.
Totally consistent with a jump of a species from an animal to a human.
How do you listen to anything this guy says and think it's true?
If Fauci did have a hand in covering all this up, why would he do it in the first place? What is he really protecting here?
All of this stuff with Fauci, I believe, is set in place to protect the interests of the people who rule the people. People so high up on the ladder that we don't even know who they are.
Yeah.
When you look at abuses of government power, information takes such a long time to come out.
The Tuskegee experiment was a U.S.-backed program.
For 40 years, the U.S. government injected over 600 black men with syphilis without telling them.
Really interesting example that I found in the middle of the pandemic.
Whether ticks were ever weaponized.
Congress decided to investigate the origin of Lyme disease.
Oh, God.
Wow.
Lyme disease. Kwame Holman has more.
1975 was the first outbreak of Lyme disease. You have the outbreak of a disease that is an augmented strain of Rocky Mountain fever, which up until 1975 only existed in Colorado. This illness is breaking out on the completely other side of the country, in Lyme, Connecticut. Lyme is just miles away from this Plum Island Animal Disease Center, which apparently was a hotspot for bioweapons research.
The researcher who was credited with discovering Lyme disease was a bioweapons specialist.
Ironically, Congress started an investigation in the middle of the COVID pandemic, decades later.
This is a lot bigger than COVID, and I think this whole bioweapons thing is a multi-decade story and a crazy one.
Vice President Dick Cheney became convinced that the United States needs to pursue a more aggressive program of biodefense research.
We're in the middle of proving our capability to do that.
Dick Cheney is part of the Project for a New American Century,
This was a manifesto about how America was going to grow its empire in the 21st century. They talked about energy dominance, they talk about military power, and they say that all of this could be possible if there was an attack on American soil. Everything that happens after 9/11 is directly connected to this story.
Anthrax.
Rare inhaled form of anthrax.
9/11 created the war on terror, and the anthrax attack created the war on bioterror. And Dick Cheney used this to completely deregulate biodefense and get it out of the Pentagon.
He found one department and one official who agreed. The official was Dr. Fauci.
This gave Anthony Fauci billions of dollars to fund the riskiest research in the world with no oversight. And this anthrax attack made Anthony Fauci the most powerful man in science.
Oversee the development of countermeasures for anthrax.
And as I listened, I didn't hear him mention anything about how that whole thing was an inside job.
The suspect committed suicide before he could be arrested.
The individual responsible was Bruce Ivins, a researcher at the Fort Detrick campus in Maryland.
Fauci becomes the head of biodefense because of a hoax committed by a biodefense researcher who allegedly commits suicide.
Think about that.
That's fucking crazy.
Think about that.
But this was never acknowledged, and he just got the billions anyway. And the hoax and all these billions of dollars go into this crazy genetic research that's extremely dangerous.
We're investigating new programs with powerful new tools.
Fauci gets dragged into all this controversy around the genetic reconstruction of the Spanish flu. This is the one that caused the 1918 pandemic. People were like, what the fuck are you doing? This virus killed hundreds of millions of people around the world and has been dormant for 100 years. Why would we want to bring it back to life?
God.
Whether that was your intention or not, you've created a bioweapon.
There were U.S. policies in place that were put in place to protect the public from laboratory-generated pandemics, and those policies were violated repeatedly and flagrantly.
This issue has provoked a lot of anger in everybody.
Scientists like Bryce Nichols and Justin Kinney are part of a movement for biosafety and are big critics of Fauci.
Fauci's legacy is tied to this type of dangerous research activity.
Doctors would have a responsibility to do no harm. But Anthony Fauci was putting the life of everyone on the planet at risk without their consent.
Researchers took bird flu and manipulated it to make it easier to transmit between humans.
Fauci was drawn into a scandal with a scientist named Ron Fouchier, who used gain of function to make bird flu airborne in mammals. This had never been done before.
We already did everything we can to protect the virus from getting out of our facilities, and well, I will leave it with that for now.
You have said to me in a phone interview that this was, quote, the doomsday virus.
There was an accident and could have infected humans.
I think that what we need to make sure is that we don't mix apples and oranges.
People have mixed opinions, but if it had leaked, the virus could have killed like 20 to 50% of the world's population.
People playing God, man. People with God complexes.
But instead of being punished for doing this work and putting the entire world's population at risk by doing this work, they were celebrating.
Fauci didn't apologize. Fauci celebrated it, and he actually wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying that this was a flu risk worth taking.
Yes, gain-of-function research could trigger a pandemic, but it is so important for public health and national security, it would be a mistake not to do it.
I personally think it's a miracle that that hasn't already been used as a bioterrorist event.
Mike?
Yeah, and let me just follow up. You know, any SARS, any number of viruses, it would be a horrible tragedy if they ever were to leak out, but we could contain them and it would not see a global pandemic.
Wait, what? SARS could get out and cause a pandemic and it wouldn't hurt the world? It would be a horrible tragedy if they ever were to leak out, but we could contain them and it would not see a global pandemic. Wow.
So I think that...
Look at this shit. Look at Fauci. Look at his face.
1977 H1N1 was an accidental release, no doubt about it.
They knew this could happen, man, and they knew it had happened before.
It's all so crazy.
We don't want to see that happen again with a virus like this. What we're trying to do is come to the middle. How to do this research safely, how to do it in a way that further...
He knew this could happen, and it seems like it's happened a lot of times before.
Epidemics of disease and fear.
In 2014, there was an Ebola outbreak in West Africa.
In Kenema, the outbreak is out of control. For medical workers,
the facts didn't add up.
Fluids could be a death
The strain of Ebola that caused the outbreak in 2014 had never been seen in West Africa before. It's found in Zaire, which is 2,000 miles away.
In 2014, a journalist named Sam Husseini had a lot of questions about this outbreak.
He traced it back to a boy in Miliandu, little Emile, but the boy's father doesn't think that he died of Ebola. The healthcare workers don't think that he died of Ebola.
A lab in Sierra Leone was suspected of being the potential source of this outbreak of Ebola.
The head of Doctors Without Borders, when she got there, she was like, I'm not setting foot in that lab. They were so appalled by the conditions.
And now, here's where the story takes a whole other twist. That lab had a lot of connections to Christian Andersen and Bob Gary. These scientists got money to do Ebola research from Fauci and Collins, and from Jeremy Farrar, and now they may be tied to a whole other cover-up.
When that outbreak happened, you had people like Peter Daszak claim that it came from bats.
There's been more and more evidence that bats are the source of Ebola virus.
Somehow, bats were the culprit that spread Ebola Zaire across a 2,000-mile journey. And there's a very disturbing pattern here.
And that pattern of deception became more obvious to people in the medical community like Dr. Marty Makary.
I had become skeptical of Dr. Fauci during the Ebola epidemic. Dr. Fauci transferred a nurse in Dallas with Ebola to the NIH Clinical Center in Washington, D.C. And then Dr. Fauci puts on an astronaut suit and walks in with a photographer and gets a photo opportunity. That's when I took a step back and thought, yes, Dr. Fauci is a nice guy, but that whole Ebola incident seemed like a circus.
After the Ebola outbreak in 2014, there was a ban on gain-of-function research. But many people think that that ban was violated and that they did even more gain-of-function research at Wuhan. David Asher was at the State Department during the pandemic. When he began investigating the origin, he found all these crazy connections between the NIH and the Wuhan lab.
In 2015, the Wuhan Institute of Virology has launched a global recruitment plan of principal investigators under the Outstanding Foreign Talents Program, quote-unquote, of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And the NIH is actually helping match scientists to the Chinese program to recruit our most sensitive biologists.
This was going to be China's first BSL-4 laboratory, which is the highest level of security.
Those are the ones where everybody has the full suit and the respirator.
The Chinese had partnered with the French to build this lab and then kicked them out the day it was finished.
Their view is a sign that there was a biological, military-related research program that had adversarial ambitions.
And this could have been a reason for the U.S. to start spying on the Wuhan lab.
Peter Daszak was very deep into this world of emerging infectious diseases and potential biological weapons or dual-use research.
A lot of people believe that Peter Daszak may have been using all of these research projects to spy on the Wuhan lab.
We started to look into it, and what we found was very alarming.
People inside Daszak's nonprofit had witnessed him talking about spying on the Chinese.
Dr. Peter Daszak and I are closing up the office, and as he locks the door, he turns to me and says, "Andrew, do you mind if I ask you a question?" "Sure, Peter, go ahead." "Well, Andrew, someone from the CIA approached me, and they're interested in the places we're working, the people we're working with, and the data we're collecting. Do you think it's a good idea that we work with them?" And I'm shocked. I mean, I couldn't believe that my boss, Dr. Peter Daszak, is ask me whether or not we should work with the CIA. In hindsight, I suspect that he had been working with the intelligence community for a long time. How far back, I don't know.
The research that Daszak was doing at Wuhan was already incredibly dangerous.
This was singled out as the research project on the planet with the highest likelihood of causing a pandemic.
Why on earth would the U.S. fund this crazy research?
The answer for me is simple. We traded the Chinese the most advanced biotechnology in the world for access to their laboratory so we could collect intelligence on it. I decided that I had to get out of the organization as fast as I could.
The situation was already dangerous, and then in 2017, the NIH lifts their ban to do even more dangerous research.
I don't think this is going to be foolproof. Things are going to slip through.
It makes you question the motives of some of these people.
Assisting the design of the Wuhan Institute of Virology was Dr. Stefan Bancel. Bancel is now the CEO of Moderna.
Stefan Bancel and the NIH had a close relationship with this lab. Moderna was researching a coronavirus vaccine to launch their mRNA platform, and they were using research that was happening at Wuhan.
My colleagues in China did the work. You create pseudoparticles, you insert the spike proteins from those viruses, see if they bind to human cells.
The U.S. was funding dangerous research at the Wuhan lab that may have been used to spy on the Chinese. And there was also research happening at Wuhan that was being used to develop an mRNA vaccine years before the pandemic ever happened. Why do we not know anything about this? But there's another bombshell that is even crazier. The pandemic may have started 3 months before it was ever reported.
Sometime in September, something happened in the Wuhan lab.
There were workers falling sick at the Wuhan Institute, and they seem to be the first people in China that we knew of to fall sick.
This is in September 2019. We didn't hear about it until December, and apparently the U.S. knew about this. I mean, they had intelligence that the military took over the lab, that they were doing drills at the airport. Look at these satellite images. The traffic at hospitals increased tenfold. And then the World Military Games happens in October. Teams from around the world compete in Wuhan. Some of them get sick, and countries with the most teams at the event are the first places to have massive outbreaks. France, Italy, Iran, the U.S. This was the first super spreader. And then in December, before the pandemic was even reported, there's an information sharing agreement between Moderna, the NIH, and Ralph Barrick's lab to share information about an mRNA vaccine, which they claim is a coincidence. And it was only 2 days after the genetic sequence was published by the Chinese that the NIH and Moderna signed a landmark vaccine deal worth nearly $50 billion.
Moderna shares are trading higher.
And then Fauci and a group of scientists with critical conflicts of interest directly connected to gain of function, to Wuhan, to spying on China, and to other potential leaks like Ebola, secretly convened, and the scientists in that meeting published 33 science papers and letters saying that there was, quote, no evidence of a lab leak, that it was a conspiracy theory, and that it came from this wet market.
It's interesting because it has jumped species likely from an animal source.
It's beyond suspicious. It's scientific malpractice on a global scale.
More cities and states have started shutdowns. New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut.
America is completely unprepared for a pandemic.
Because it is evil.
Even though Fauci claimed his sole purpose for doing this dangerous research was to prepare for a pandemic.
Bring in Dr. Anthony Fauci.
And Fauci jumps in front of the cameras to become the spokesperson for a pandemic he may have had a hand in creating.
I mean, he was doing media interviews from 6 a.m. in the morning till 12 midnight.
People should not be walking around with masks. Right now, people.
But the problem is, all that messaging was wrong.
Whether schools should be closed or open.
The schools should be closed.
The right answer for many of the big questions during the COVID pandemic was, we don't know. But instead, they made it up.
How could we ever look at this story the same way again? How could we ever look at this man the same way again? How could we ever see him as a hero ever again?
There's a new social media challenge.
And why did the American media decide not to cover any of it?
Because it's the safe thing to do.
This was the same media that had driven the country apart, and by the time we got to the pandemic, we were so fucked, all we had was the news replaying clips of Sarah Silverman singing to herself. But not all people on the left fell for this, and there were journalists like Christian Parenti who could see this more clearly.
You've got the intelligence services, you've got the scientific establishment, you've got the pharmaceutical companies, you've got the political parties. Like the gauntlet had been thrown down. Both sides in our political system, the Republicans and the Democrats, had staked out their positions. Kung flu. Trump misreads it.
Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute.
Most incompetent and uninformed.
And the Democrats are thinking, this time we finally got him. He's misunderstanding this virus.
He takes no responsibility.
He still doesn't have a plan.
So they go all in on ratcheting up fear.
I feel like I'm going to have to rewire myself.
You know what I'd like to do?
All of a sudden, Fauci became a hero to everyone who hated Trump.
That faceplant transformed him into a progressive idol who soon had bobblehead dolls and votive candles and an audience of people who imagined he was all that stood between them and Donald Trump. He leaned into the celebrity. That is why he was shielded.
He became a patron saint of science just because it was politically convenient.
I want to say thank you, Dr. Fauci, for your perseverance in leading us all through this pandemic.
Here's to you, Anthony Fauci.
I almost feel bad for these people. It's like they got played.
Thank you for your invaluable public service.
Can I have your autograph?
It just feels like a Black Mirror episode.
Dr. Fauci, you are my hero.
It's insane.
I thank you for fighting a good fight.
Thank you for being kind.
Tony, we love you. We honor you. We thank God for you.
Dr. Fauci, I want to thank you for always telling the truth, even during the hardest moments.
Despite the fact there was all this evidence that connected him to the birth of this pandemic in the first place, people were thanking him for his service.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci.
This became such a perverse, politically driven story.
Congratulations!
Frontline workers were thanking him even though he may have put their lives at risk.
Congratulations on being named the Federal Employee of the Year.
Yeah, it's disgusting. So it's disgusting.
And so you get this layering of independent interests that come together to just push hysteria and fear and support for censorship and support for authoritarian control.
And a lot of these COVID policies enraged the country and led us to the brink of civil war.
Attacks on me, quite frankly, are attacks on science.
Fauci just manipulated people and said that they were anti-science if they disagreed with him. Specifically about the vaccine mandates.
Mandating vaccines.
And I actually encourage it.
Big scenes of violence out here earlier today.
It was generally believed the reason the COVID pandemic was continuing was the unvaccinated, and the unvaccinated was a term for conservative Republicans, often in rural areas, who were uneducated.
Oh, you can't shame them. You can't call them stupid. You can't call them silly. Yes, they are.
But the reality was the biggest group of unvaccinated Americans by percentage was African Americans, because they distrusted public health for good reasons. You go back to the barbaric experiments that our medical establishment did to that community.
So when you see Nicki Minaj, Lakeith, Kanye reluctant to take the vaccination, they're all made to look crazy.
A fan had shot this video of Busta Rhymes.
These little weird-ass government policies and mandates suck a dick.
He was criticized, but his rage was justified.
I'm trying to take our civil liberties away.
Take Kyrie Irving. All the damage done for not taking the vaccination. Fortunately for Kyrie Irving, he's a multi-millionaire several times over. But I know some teachers, or I know some firemen. I know a lot of people had to resign.
Average Americans were enraged, so it's not a surprise to see Fauci on 60 Minutes having to go for a walk with bodyguards.
Dr. Fauci now power walks, flanked by federal agents.
Critically minded journalists went along with BS and didn't question things that they knew they should have questioned.
No one was questioning Fauci or Peter Daszak. People just fell for it. Even renowned economist Jeffrey Sachs fell for Peter Daszak. Sachs and Peter Daszak were working on this commission for The Lancet, which was the same journal that published his conspiracy theory letter. And it wasn't until Ebright sent Sachs all of these research grants with Daszak, Wuhan, Ralph Baric, that Sachs finally confronted Daszak.
The next day, I contacted Dashik and I said I'd like to see the whole thing. Dashik's response to me was, I can't give that to you. My lawyers say I can't give that to you. I said, Peter, what are you saying? No, my lawyers say I can't give that to you.
There's a consistent line of evidence and a consistent line of obfuscation, which is usually when guilty parties are trying to engage in a cover-up. And, you don't have to be Woodward and Bernstein to figure this shit out in Washington. Looked to me like it had a lot to do with Tony Fauci cutting big checks and perhaps elements of the intelligence community encouraging individuals not to be so forthcoming either. We don't really know.
The State Department just dropping what it calls previously undisclosed...
After the State Department report comes out, the WHO sends a group to Wuhan to investigate. And what is absolutely crazy is Peter Daszak was leading the WHO mission to Wuhan. Apparently China refused to approve most of the scientists that were presented, but for some reason, they approved Peter Daszak.
Here was my former boss conducting gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which could have been the place where this disease originated, now investigating the origin of the disease. I couldn't believe it.
You look at these images of Daszak at the Wuhan lab, it's all so brazen, and it just makes you question everything.
I came to understand that some conspiracy theories are wrong, but many are right, actually.
Did you find anything inside? And after the Wuhan trip, there's the first release of these emails through the Freedom of Information Act. But they're all like redacted. And so why are they redacted if Fauci and the NIH have nothing to hide?
You've had the distinct honor and pleasure of having many of your emails released to the public over the last few days.
And Fauci goes on this media tour.
They only took about 10,000 emails from me. Of course I remember. I remember all 10,000 of them. Give me a break.
And they did, with a lot of the outlets taking his word for it.
Those 3,200 pages of emails don't appear to contain anything particularly explosive.
It's preposterous, Chuck. Totally preposterous.
We've struggled to understand why there's controversy around it.
Chuck Todd even says there's really nothing here, and yet he doesn't ask him what was in all of the redacted emails. He could release all this stuff with no scrutiny, and it just goes to show how powerful he was.
He's been there for 50 years, so he's like J. Edgar Hoover, and the only way that you last 50 years is by carrying water for the pharmaceutical industry.
Robert Kennedy Jr. had written 2 whole books about Anthony Fauci, and one of RFK's biggest talking points was the censorship. You couldn't find information because people were being erased off the internet. Adam Andrzejewski had started